Well, let's talk now to the Director of Public Policy at the South African Zionist Federation, Benji Shulman. Benji, good evening to you and welcome to the program. As the world gears up for this landmark set of hearings, what is your position or the position of your organization on South Africa's pursuit of a case of genocide?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Imran, and very nice to be here. Good evening to the listeners and the viewers. Our position is that this does nothing to address the issue of genocide. In fact, we believe that the South African government is undermining the cause of genocide. We see this mainly as being a push by the ANC to protect its allies, which include Iran and Hamas. And it shows that it doesn't care about genocide, because just last week, President Ramaphosa met with the genocidal regime of Sudan, and we believe that this will not do anything to promote peace in the region or an end to the war.
Well, what about other countries who don't share, South Africa's allies, for example, who are also supporting this case? What do you say of their support for South Africa's pursuit of this case at the ICJ?
So there are no other countries that have formally supported Israel at the ICJ. So the South Africa at the ICJ. It currently is bringing this application alone. And there have been some states that have issued support verbally, although they haven't joined the case. And all of those states have atrocious human rights records and would not share any of the values of our constitution in South Africa.
There's an op-ed piece published earlier from the chairperson of the South African Zionist Federation. There's an interesting opening sentence there that words, meanings and intentions are intrinsically connected. History has taught the Jews and other victims of genocide that when groups repeatedly make genocidal threats against them, they're often sincere in their intentions. Just explain for our viewers what was trying to be brought across in that sentence.
The point about the genocide and the intentions and words is that Hamas has repeatedly in its charter said that it's looking to kill Jews, and it followed up with that with the massacre on October 7th, where it also took the hostages of a variety of people. And what's happened since is that we've found that they've actually said that if they got the opportunity, they will do it again. And so because we have these violent words and actions being expressed by Hamas, what you find is that they then feel empowered to act on those and kill civilians as a result. And unless Hamas can be stopped and unless the hostages can be released, then there's no way in which the people of Israel can live without continuous harassment and violence.
By the same token, critics of that position will say, well, let's look at South Africa's 84-page submission and quote what they quote from the Israeli administration. People like the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything. If it doesn't take a day, it'll take a week, it will take months, etc., etc. We will reach all places. Also, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture, Avi Dichter, we are now actually rolling out the Gaza Nakba, and this is in relation to the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and so on. Could use the same principle there, couldn't we, Benji?
No, I don't think so. In fact, if you look at the report, what's very interesting, the South Africans have not done their homework, and in fact, in some cases have misconstrued precisely the kind of people that we're talking about in those statements. So, for example, you had President Herzog, who was on earlier, and he specifically and very calculatingly focused on Hamas as being the primary object. That's been the primary statement of the government and the people who've been in charge of the war who actually said these statements. And the report has tried to misconstrue them so that they look like they're coming from and are about the Palestinian people, which has no point been the position of the Israeli government, and they've said so. And when ministers have stepped out of line, so for example, there was a minister of heritage who said something appalling, which is not correct, he was immediately thrown out of the cabinet and reprimanded by the government. And if you look at the actions that the Israeli state is taking, where they are sending millions of SMSs, making phone calls every single day, dropping leaflets, opening humanitarian corridors, helping to let in aid where possible so that it's not being used by Hamas. This is the most appropriate way to deal with the war, where you're trying to minimize civilian casualties. And if you look, for example, at groups who have done this, who've looked independently at this, for example, the high-level military report group, you will find that actually Israel takes more precautions than any other democratic Western nation in the history of the world in order to reduce civilian casualties.
All right, so then you have the facts on the ground, right, which is the consequences of all of this, again, which forms part of South Africa's case, joined by a number of groups and activists and organizations around the world. Israeli Prime Minister spokesperson Ilan Levy saying the military campaign designed to prevent the genocide of the Jews. How do you defend that in the face of what we're talking about now, the extraordinary numbers of Palestinians killed, South Africa's application recording 70% of the deaths, reportedly women and children, and in the addendum corroborated by a number of independent international agencies connected to the UN, for example, the bombardment of homes and refugee camps, hospitals, schools, and so on. Numbers, masses of people, children and old people, including the sick, displaced. How does that intention that you've just stated with us actually manifest? Does it not contradict that intention?
As I said before, if you look at the actual numbers, Israel's rate of killing combatants versus killing civilians, right? We have to be very clear that in a war, no one wants to have any civilians killed, which no one wants to see, but unfortunately civilians do die. But if you look at the number of civilians that have been killed in this particular war versus the number of combatants, you will find that that number is less than 3 times even in the US or the UK when they are fighting similar wars versus, say, ISIS in Iraq or Syria. And certainly if you look at other wars in the region, such as, for example, Syria, there you had civilian populations 20 or 30 times what's dying in Gaza. So I think we have to be very careful to differentiate between the deaths of civilians, which are unfortunate, and the fact that Hamas is, first of all, only targeting civilians when it fires its rockets and promotes its attacks, and how it uses an extensive UN infrastructure, school infrastructure, mosque infrastructure as a launching pad for its rockets, which is a crime under international law. And as soon as those places are used for armed combat under international law, they become targets, legitimate targets for military attacks. So we do have to lay the blame at Hamas for causing these deaths. And I think as soon as a pro-peace regime comes out in that area, this will no longer be a problem.
I want to run through the next 3 very quickly if we can, Benji. We're up against the clock. But Israel is obliged as a state party to the convention to uphold the ICJ's findings. Judgments are binding on parties involved. No appeal is allowed. Are you bracing for the possibility that the court will not see things Israel's way?
So look, I'm not the Israeli state. I represent the South African Jewish community, and I think that legal responses by states to legal outcomes would have to be done by them. What I can say is that it's not acceptable to expect states not to go and rescue hostages which are still being held by Hamas. States have the right to self-defense, and I don't think that the international community will allow a situation in which the right to self-defense can be undermined.
Do you think, just finally, also very quickly, you have seen a great deal, a groundswell of international support for South Africa's application. I mentioned hundreds of organizations globally urging state parties to invoke the Genocide Convention. The collective social pressure is mounting against Israel and also includes Jewish voices from Israel and around the world. What is the picture you believe they are failing to see? And are you worried that Israel will find itself on the wrong side of history on this?
What I hope that the world eventually sees is that Israel is only the first group of people who suffer from this. Historically speaking, these sorts of groups, after they attack Jews, they attack other people. And as we've seen over the Christmas period in Africa, the same groups that are connected to Hamas murdered Christians in a church in Nigeria. They attacked a church in northern Israel. And Israel really stands on the front line of really democracy in the Middle East. And if the world does not support Israel in its defense against these very extreme Islamist elements, then unfortunately they're going to be next. And I think that will be a grave concern to all people around the world.
Thank you, Benji Shulman, the Director of Public Policy from the South African Zionist Federation.
Thank you.